Sorghum and Steel, the Socialist Developmental Regime and the Forging of China. From Chuang Number 1, Dead Generations, published July 2016. Introduction, Transitions. In the late 16th century, one of the earliest long-form accounts of life within China was released in Europe. The author was a Portuguese mercenary named Galeote Pereira, who had fought on behalf of Ayutthaya against the Burmese in the East Asian mainland's first early modern war. Afterwards, he became a pirate on the South China Sea, pillaging coastal provinces in the beginning of what would become a centuries-long piracy epidemic facilitated by the growth of the global market. The Ming Dynasty responded with its piracy extermination campaign, and Pereira was captured in Fujian and exiled to the interior, only escaping back to Europe years later through bribery and the help of Portuguese merchants in Guangzhou. His account of the experience, edited and published with the help of the Jesuits, was one of the only first-hand reports on China available since the time of Marco Polo. But Marco Polo had come from a backwater, provincial Europe to observe the internal operations of the most advanced civilization the world had yet seen in the form of the Yuan Mongol dynasty. Pereira, on the other hand, had come from a much-changed Europe and arrived in a much-changed China, both of which were sitting on the brink of a great approaching chaos. If there was any point of utter indeterminacy in the birth of the capitalist world, this was it. The die had been cast, but not yet settled. With the largest navy, the most advanced technology, and unprecedented agricultural productivity, the Ming Dynasty remained the most extensive and powerful political structure in the world. In every way, it matched and surpassed Europe, and the question of China's failed transition to capitalism, known as Needham's paradox, would become a sort of initiatory riddle for future scholars of the region. Pereira had arrived in the midst of the Ming's deterioration, caused in part by the Portuguese and Spanish silver industries and the new trade networks of which he himself was a product. But the most striking feature of Pereira's report was not its author's checkered history, nor his descriptions of the ornate but effective Ming judicial system. Instead, it was a curious fact that, among all the Chinese people he spoke to, none had heard of China, nor any of its supposedly native correlates, variants on Chonghua, the middle or central country or countries. Pereira himself traveled exclusively in what is today southern China, traversing Fujian, Guangdong, Guangxi, and Guizhou provinces. These regions were host to a myriad of local dialects, most as mutually incommunicable as European languages are from one another, often centered on local place ties and the trade networks that connected coastal regions to Southeast Asia. Nor were these provinces settled by the Han ethnicity exclusively, and even the existence of such a category has recently been called into question. Instead, the region had been home to the Hui, Baiyu, She, Miayao, Chong, and numerous other ethno-linguistic groups. China was very much a product of the Occidental imagination. The people Pereira asked had trouble even understanding the question of what country they were from, as there was no clear indigenous correlate to the concept. Ultimately, they explained that there was one ruler, but many countries, which still used their ancient names. The combination of these countries composed the Great Ming, but each retained much of its local specificity. This detail was a mere curiosity when the account was published in Europe, which had established China as its arcane ancient counterpart, less a name for a country than a designation for the external limits to early capitalist expansion and colonization. Such projects tend to run aground on the East Asian mainland, which proved capable of massive trade in goods and silver, but resistant to true incorporation into the new global economy. China designated an obstruction of sorts, an ominous exception to the new rules being established in the West. Today, in a crisis-stricken global economy, China is again defined by its exceptions. Its staggering ascent seems to promise an almost messianic escape from decades of declining growth, the mirage of a new America, complete with a Chinese dream and the moral zeal of its puritanical CCP Confucianism. For the Western economist, this takes the form of a steady-handed Sino-Keynesianism, as new infrastructure projects are initiated by more charitable global financial institutions, such as the China Development Bank, promising the salvation of the world's final far-flung hinterlands. In the official discourse of the Chinese state, This represents nothing more than the slow transition to communism, with a long layover in the stage of socialism with Chinese characteristics, wherein capitalist mechanisms are used to develop the productive forces until general wealth is possible. In both narratives, China remains an obscure, somewhat ominous exception, despite its complete incorporation to the global economy. Somehow it seems exempt from the rules, with a vague intuition that, with such a large population, such a powerful government, such a massive concentration of fixed capital, etc., the Chinese thereby hold some sort of deus ex machina for the drama of our current global economic decline. The problem in this reading is the same as that confronted by Pereira centuries ago. The very object of inquiry proves illusory. The mercenary enters the heart of the empire only to discover that the empire does not exist. One of our primary aims in Chuang is to disperse this mirage. We hope to view China with clarity and communist intent, but the only way to understand contemporary China and its contradictions is to begin with an inquiry into the creation of China as such. Here our story does not begin in a supposedly ancient history, as both Western and Chinese historians would so firmly have us believe, nor does it begin with the romance of the Chinese revolutionary project, alternately glorified and demonized by those on the left. China is, and always has been, an economic category. The Occidental mirage of the Far East arose to designate the stubborn persistence of various non-capitalist modes of production on the East Asian mainland. After the opening of China demonstrated the Qing Empire's fundamental incoherence, late imperial nationalists, often educated in the West, picked through the region's history to construct a narrative of a coherent Chinese nation-state stretching back to ancient times. This project was soon continued by liberals, anarchists, and communists alike. Since the indigenous narrative of China arose in the midst of a crippled empire, ruled in law by one foreign force, the Manchus, and in fact by another, the West, one of the key characteristics of the newly imagined Chinese nations was its foundation in a suppressed Han culture and ethnic identity. Opposition to the Qing first took on the character of a restoration of Han rule, and newly formed resistance organizations such as secret societies were perceived as partisans of this lost national essence. Their slogan, Fan Qing Fu Ming, oppose the Qing, restore the Ming. But what was the Ming these early nationalists sought to restore? In one sense, this demand harkened back to that fundamental indeterminacy, when the die of history was still flying through the air, and it seemed that the great Ming, rather than Western Europe, could have given birth to capitalism in all its blood and glory. At the same time, restore the Ming was a sort of promise. It meant development along Western lines, the creation of China as an entity comparable to, and on equal footing with, those Western nations that had divided the region into a mesh of trade agreements and treaty ports. It was this promise that would come to fruition in the 20th century. The story we tell below explains the century-long creation of China as an economic entity. Unlike the nationalists, we do not hope to uncover any secret lineage of culture, language, or ethnicity in order to explain the unique character of today's China. Unlike many leftists, we also do not seek to trace out the red thread in history, discovering where the socialist project went wrong, and what could have been done to achieve communism in some alternate universe. Instead, we aim to inquire into the past in order to understand our present moment. What does the current slowdown in Chinese growth bode for the global economy? What hope, if any, do contemporary struggles in China hold for any future communist project? Our long-term goal is to answer these questions, to compose a coherent communist perspective on China not muddled by the romance of dead revolutions or the hysteria of rapid growth rates. Below we offer the first in a three-part history of the emergence of China out of the global imperatives of capitalist accumulation. In this issue, we cover the explicitly non-capitalist portion of this history, the socialist era and its immediate precursors, which saw the development of the first modern industrial infrastructure on the East Asian mainland. The second section, to be published in the next issue of Chuang, will cover the reform and opening initiated in the late 1970s, ending with the destruction of the Iron Rice Bowl during the deindustrialization wave of the 1990s. The final section, to be published in the third issue, will cover the period following this deindustrialization and continuing today, including the capitalist transformation of agriculture and the creation of China's contemporary proletariat. This periodization is not arbitrary. We segment this history according to both the global periodization laid out by the Anglophone Communist Collective endnotes and according to key shifts in the degree of incorporation of the region into global accumulation imperatives. The first section covers a non-capitalist period, in which the popular movement led by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, succeeded in both destroying the old regime and halting the transition to capitalism, leaving the region stuck in an inconsistent stasis understood at the time to be socialism. The socialist system, which we refer to as a developmental regime, was neither a mode of production nor a transitional stage between capitalism and communism, nor even between a tributary mode of production and capitalism. Since it was not a mode of production, it was also not a form of state capitalism, in which capitalist imperatives were pursued under the guise of the state, with the capitalist class simply replaced in form, but not function, by the hierarchy of government bureaucrats. Instead, the socialist developmental regime designates the breakdown of any mode of production and the disappearance of the abstract mechanisms, whether tributary, filial, or marketized, that govern modes of production as such. Under these conditions, only strong state-led strategies of development were capable of driving development of the productive forces. The bureaucracy grew because the bourgeoisie couldn't. Given China's poverty and position relative to the long arc of capitalist expansion, only the big push industrialization programs of a strong state, paired with resilient local configurations of power, were capable of successfully constructing an industrial system. But the construction of an industrial system is not the same as the successful transition to a new mode of production. This industrial system was not immediately or naturally capitalist. History is fundamentally contingent. In the socialist era, markets did not exist as they had previously under the imperial system, nor as they would in the future under capitalism. Money existed nominally, but it was not guided by either the mercantile imperatives of the tributary mode of production, nor the value imperatives of the capitalist system. Instead, it was the mere mechanical reflection of state planning, which was not calculated according to prices, but according to sheer quantities of industrial product. Money could not function as a universal equivalent. Meanwhile, rents were extracted in the countryside in the form of grain via the price scissors, but this extraction did not mirror that of the imperial taxation system, nor did it result in the dispossession of the peasantry and the privatization of agricultural land. Maybe most importantly, the peasantry was fixed in place more firmly than at any other period in Chinese history. The rural-urban divide that took shape in these years would become a fundamental feature of the developmental regime. There was no substantial urbanization under socialism, aside from that caused by immediate post-war reconstruction and natural increase. And the demographic transition, in which a rural agricultural population is supplanted by urban workers in industry and services, failed to occur. Meanwhile, there was no evidence of any transition toward communism, which remained a merely ideological horizon. The workforce expanded, working hours tended to increase, and the socialization of production created autarkic and atomized local productive units, delivering collective living in the small scale, but failing to create the new communal society that had been promised. Freedom of movement decreased as crises proliferated. Two distinct elite classes formed. The rural-urban divide widened, and a class of dispossessed laborers began to take shape in the final decades of the period. Strikes and other forms of unrest proliferated, culminating in the short Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1969, the suppression of which would ultimately lead to a full-on capitalist transition. Throughout the revolutionary period and into the late 1950s, we refer to this process as a communist project. This project was incredibly diverse throughout its existence, and it was always defined by its status as a mass movement with deep roots in the populace. Early on, its theoretical foundation and strategic direction was predominantly that of anarchist communists. Over time, the particular vision and strategy of the CCP would gain hegemony, but this also meant that the CCP itself absorbed some of the movement's heterogeneity, which would take on the form of factions and purges within the party itself. This hegemony wasn't imposed upon the project, however. It was a result of a popular mandate given to the CCP, which had been integral to the formation of a successful peasant army and underground workers' movement during the Japanese occupation. The CCP maintained its hegemony of the Communist project in the early post-war years by heading popular redistribution campaigns in the countryside and reconstructing the cities. With the failures of the late 1950s, famine in the country, and strikes in the coastal cities, not only was the CCP's popular mandate called into question, but the Communist project itself began to ossify. As popular participation evaporated in response to these failures, what had been a mass communist project was reduced to its means, the developmental regime. This regime itself could only be maintained by the increasingly extensive intervention of the party, which both fused it with the state as a de facto bureaucratic administrative apparatus and severed its coupling with the communist project. Even at the height of its diversity, however, this project was ultimately defined by a particular communist horizon that had emerged from the combination of the European workers' movement and the region's own history of millenarian peasant revolts. Today, this communist horizon no longer exists. There is no point in taking sides on these historical matters, simply because there is no symmetry between them and now. The material conditions, rapid industrial expansion, large non-capitalist periphery, etc., that structured this earlier communist horizon are absent, even if the fundamental crises of capitalism remain. There is no question of whether communists today will face the same problems. They won't. Instead, there remains only the question of how communism and communist strategy can be conceived without this horizon. To today's communists, among whom we are included, the practice, strategy, and theory of the CCP, as well as others within this historical communist current, seem at best alien, and at worst, abhorrent. Despite the harsh material limits of the time, we can say clearly that many actions of the CCP are simply unjustifiable. Others are arcane or incomprehensibly overconfident. But these sort of value judgments have little analytic function. Numerous accounts have already been written on the era describing it in terms of false communists betraying true ones, or simply as a product of zealous and greedy leaders. The history we review is not a history of morals. For our materialist approach, questions of betrayal or rectitude have only the most minuscule relevance. The Chinese Communist project was a collective phenomenon, created by the effort and support of millions. We attempt to write a history of this collective project and its ultimate demise. To these ends, our goal is also to explain the Chinese socialist era, rather than addressing questions of 20th century socialism in general. Comparative studies of different revolutionary projects would certainly be worthwhile, but such studies require fair units of comparison. Today, the literature on China and other socialist states tend to be strongly shaped by the Russian experience. One of our fundamental theses is simply that China is not Russia. Though influenced by Russian experience, the Chinese attempts to emulate it was never complete, and were nonetheless being applied in a fundamentally different context. More importantly, the Russian reference point was itself constantly moving, and the Chinese often drew from divergent periods in Russian history when designing their own forms of enterprise management and industrial planning. Beyond this, the geography of Russian influence was uneven. Outside the northeastern industrial heartland, Chinese production was more strongly shaped by other systems of enterprise management, economic planning, and state administration. If the Chinese took Russia as one model, they also inherited numerous others, from the Imperial era, the nationalist regime of the Republican period, the Japanese, and the Western enterprises in coastal cities. All of these influences were combined in conscious attempts to create a distinctly Chinese nation, complete with a unified national economy. The result was a far more decentralized, uneven system than is visible in the era's propaganda. Another of our fundamental theses is that there was a stark difference between what socialist China said and what it did. Too much of the current literature, both academic and that produced by the left, uses untrustworthy data drawn from shaky sources. It is founded on outdated evidence gathered in a time when there were political gains or losses at stake in one's line on things like the Cultural Revolution. The basic methods used in such literature are idealist. Propaganda is examined as if it were a matter-of-fact description of the industrial system. Model factories are described as if they mirror the real thing. The mythos of Chinese socialism is expected to match up, one for one, with the actual composition of Chinese society. China again becomes a sort of mirage, this time reformatted for the new coordinates of the Cold War. The result is a Potemkin village version of socialist China, by one side vilified, and by the other held up as one of the only flickering lights in the darkness of a century lost. Today we have no money riding on either. The only stakes we see are those posed by our present moment, a China that is central to the global economy, but also stricken by its crises, its growth slowing, its population torn between an absent future and an unreachable past. If these are the real stakes, then they merit an historical analysis worthy of them. Our goal is to use the most concrete and reliable measures available in order to narrate a materialist history of China. The socialist mythology represented in propaganda, popular ceremony, and everyday custom is not ignored, but instead relegated to its actual significance, that of an ideological project ultimately taking on the resilience of a religion, capable of expressing certain hopes, fears, and social truths, but incapable of describing the actual existing economy. Our focus is on hard numbers, newly unclassified evidence, and an array of more reliable ethnographies and archival research projects. The result, we hope, is a picture of socialist China as it actually was, neither a totalitarian wasteland nor the kingdom of heaven. The nation we illustrate below was not Mao's China in any meaning of the phrase. It was a project constructed by millions of people, and its ultimate, though not historically determined, result is the China we see today, a China that holds the global economy together at its disintegrating roots, a China that, we hope, will also finally be undone by more millions of Chinese people, alongside billions of others destroying their thousand nations and, with them, this monstrous economy that yokes each to all and all to none. Part 1. Precedents. The Last Dynasties. Development in the Imperial era does not begin with the stasis of so-called traditional China. The imperial state, often in competition with members of the land-owning elite, periodically intervened in rural society, each time reshaping its social character. In one of the last significant interventions, inaugurating the late imperial period, the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, attempted to create an independent peasantry in order to eliminate rivals vying for control over the rural surplus product and to stabilize society. In order to do this, peasants were given land, although not as equitably as originally intended. At this time, as in much of the region's history, peasants were not just farmers. They farmed but also produced handicraft items, in particular silk or cotton cloth, and the Ming state, as with the earlier ruling dynasties, encouraged this dual production by requiring tax payments in grain, cloth, and labor. The dual nature of rural production was to last until the early socialist period, when collectivization would bring it to an end. Notably, handicraft production remained rural to a greater degree and much longer than in Europe. The urban nature of production in Europe made it more capital-intensive over time, whereas production in the Ming and Qing had a rural and labor bias. Over the same time period, Europe had an urban and capital bias. This meant that the rural-urban divide was weaker in the Ming and Qing, and production was more diffuse. In fact, from the mid-13th until the 19th century, the urban population actually shrank relative to the rural population. In Europe, the reverse was true. In the rural-urban continuum, common to mainland East Asia, numerous villages would surround a market town, Shi. On market days, peasants, merchants, and gentry would go to these towns which, by the Ming and Qing, had become linked to the global economy. Large administrative and intermediate marketing towns, Chen, developed alongside Ming commercialization. A sharp rural-urban divide would emerge only in the 20th century, largely a result of socialist-era policies. As production grew in the late imperial period, so did rural surplus and regional and empire-wide trade. This developed into a Ming commercial revolution that brought increased inequality in rural land ownership. With commercialization, the tax system became too complex to maintain, and the state shifted to tax payment in silver instead of in kind. Rural Ming society became dominated by the land-owning gentry, which is particularly strong in the developed South. This gentry either rented out land or engaged in large-scale managerial farming, often using bonded labor from peasants who had lost their land and could no longer survive independently in the commercializing economy. With the commercialization of the rural handicraft industry, the control of female bonded labor became increasingly financially important to the managerial farms. A form of patriarchal landlordism developed, in which the estates managed female labor along with their marriage and sexuality. With commercialization, tenancy contracts became more and more impersonal, and tenants grew poorer. The Ming gentry increasingly moved into the cities as absentee landlords, especially in the South. Rural poverty led to more migration and a general breakdown of the Ming state's control over rural society and rural revenue collection. The early Ming system essentially disintegrated under the pressure of commercialization, and its experiment in creating a small-scale peasant economy ended in failure. As the Ming state weakened in the late 16th century, peasants began resisting rent, and in many regions, this led to rebellion. New radical and millenarian critiques of profit-seeking arose alongside egalitarian and communal ideals. These peasant struggles forced the rural landowning gentry into a weaker position and led to expanded tenant rights in many areas of China, transforming landlordism from the Ming into the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911. It also largely ended bonded labor and patriarchal landlordism. As a result of the tenant peasantry's stronger position, investments in rental land brought lower returns for landlords, rarely above 8% before taxation by the 19th century, according to some estimates, and certainly lower than could be made by investments in commerce or usury. Farm size decreased from the late Ming, and by the early 20th century, few managerial farms existed. Patriarchal landlordism transformed into the patriarchal peasant household. Peasant household patriarchy was mainly concerned with the control of household labor, and the economic logic of these household production units aimed at satisfying household subsistence. As labor could not be laid off from the household, the tendency was to keep adding labor inputs until consumption was met, even as the marginal productivity of those inputs continued to drop. Under these conditions, peasant rationality was the rationality of survival, not of profit maximization. Agricultural labor productivity was largely stagnant, and increased production was the result of labor intensification. Instead of increasing labor productivity and economic development, as production increased, labor productivity dropped, a process called involution. The rural gentry shifted strategies in response to peasant resistance and rebelled at the time of the Ming-Qing transition, profiting from more commerce and usury than from land rents. In other words, rural labor was controlled by the patriarchal household instead of the gentry, while surplus was extracted by elite control over rural markets. This shift transformed the ways in which the rural gentry in the late imperial state attempted to control rural surplus extraction during the Qing. Instead of focusing on land rents, the gentry would buy the surpluses produced by peasants and sell them to households that processed them, then buy them from those households in turn and sell them into the urban and mainly regional markets, with a small amount ending up in international markets. This was not a putting out system as was seen in Europe. Earlier in the Ming, most rural households had not produced commodities for sale on markets, but had instead produced a variety of goods for subsistence and then sold a small surplus to the rural gentry, who would then resell these products as commodities. But with increased commercialization and specialization, more households began to focus on commodity production without abandoning subsistence production for their family units, a situation of commercialization without development. Over time, many began to satisfy their reproductive needs through market purchases as well, with areas that produce higher-end goods buying food through regional markets from more peripheral areas. And it was the rural gentry that controlled those markets. In this situation, gentry landlords rarely intervened in the production or labor process itself, instead buying low and selling high. They controlled access to markets and capital, but not the production process. Surplus was extracted by a gentry, in other words, that cared little about the relative productivity of the production process, and thus did not invest in transforming production. Furthermore, under this labor-intensive system, almost the whole economy remained rural in nature. The late imperial Chinese economy lacked an urban entrepreneurial class comparable to the one in Europe. That turned the rural surplus of the agrarian revolution into capitalist development. Whatever rural surplus existed, the exact amount a point of much debate, the surplus was not easily directed towards increasingly capital-intensive development that significantly raised labor productivity. From household to world market, the late 19th century until the 1930s marks a period in which most developed areas of Chinese agriculture became formally subsumed within the global capitalist market. At that time, rural China, in particular coastal regions, was tied into the global price-setting market for agricultural commodities known as the First Global Food Regime. Foreign merchants, their Chinese agents, and Chinese merchants reached into the rural-urban continuum, transforming markets and squeezing peasant producers. The wave of commercialization since the Ming, together with the subsumption of rural markets within global capitalism, meant that, by the 1930s, in many areas up to 40% of agricultural production ended up on the market, the number reaching 50% in the most developed regions. While merchants and gentry merchants often did well with the integration of Chinese and international markets, the results for peasant households were more mixed. Nonetheless, rural consumption levels were not far below that of urban residents, estimated at around 81% of average urban consumption in the 1930s, a ratio that probably lasted until the mid-1950s, although this perhaps says more about the weakness of the urban economy than the strength of the rural. The effects of integration depended on the product one specialized in. Tea producers, for example, suffered from the 1880s onward once the British tea plantations in South Asia were producing in full swing. In the cotton textile industry, spinners of yarn had a hard time competing with foreign machine-spun yarns. In contrast, the cheap imports of such yarn initially allowed cloth weavers to do well, and only over time did they too have increasing trouble on the new market. Foreign-owned industrial weaving facilities along the coast, mostly built since the turn of the century, began to cut into the handicraft market. Sourcing much of its yarn from abroad, the industry led in part to the initial disintegration of the rural-urban continuum. The emerging international market in agricultural commodities began to break up following World War I due to the war itself and shrinking trade during the Great Depression. This led to the first attempts to construct a national capitalist economy in China. By the 1930s, the industrial sector, manufacturing, textiles, mining, utilities, and construction, still constituted only 7.5% of China's economy. Agriculture employed about 80% of the working population. Personal consumption accounted for about 90% of national income, and international trade was still quite small. During this new phase, the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, hereafter GMD, that had taken over much of China by the end of the 1920s, attempted to complete the capitalist transition and build a national economy by creating a stronger link between industrial facilities in the coastal cities and the raw materials produced in rural China. By the 1930s, factions of the GMD consciously looked to an Italian fascist model of economic independence and productivism to reintegrate the rural and urban spheres. This implies strong government control over internal markets and state-private cooperation in industrialization. Yet these policies were sidelined by administrative weakness. GMD leader Chiang Kai-shek's focus on military development and the subsequent Japanese invasion of the Chinese coast in 1937 that inaugurated World War II in Asia. Despite its problems, agriculture probably still produced a surplus above consumption levels in the 1930s, although most likely a very low one. Yet the economy was structured in such a way that this surplus was not mobilized for investment in an industrialization process. Uneven subsumption of pre-existing regional markets within global capitalism had led to a disintegrated economic landscape, and no real Chinese economy came into existence. The GMD attempt to build a national economy in the 1930s had failed with a descent into war. Creating a national economy, together with increasing the absolute surplus produced, were problems that the socialist developmental regime would aim to overcome, with the institutionalization of a new rural-urban relationship that began to emerge in the 1950s, one that would break the rural-urban continuum for good. Party, city, and peasant. By the time of the Japanese invasion, the GMD found its main opposition in the form of a peasant army mobilized by a reinvented Chinese Communist Party, CCP. But the CCP itself had begun decades earlier, born out of the same tumultuous intellectual milieu as the GMD itself, both of which began as largely urban affairs. The CCP's 1921 founding Congress was originally intended to take place in Shanghai. Disrupted by police, the meeting was moved north to Jiaxing, where 12 delegates founded the CCP as a branch of the Communist International. As the early CCP grew, it remained a mostly urban project, staffed by intellectuals and skilled industrial workers. 6 years after its founding, it was again in Shanghai that this first incarnation of the CCP came to its violent end. In a Russian-backed alliance with the GMD, revolutionaries seized control over most of China's key cities in a series of worker-staffed insurrections. After victory was secured, with the success of the 1927 Shanghai insurrection, the GMD turned against the communists, arresting 1,000 CCP members and leaders of local trade unions, officially executing some 300 and disappearing thousands more. The Shanghai massacre initiated a nationwide destruction of the urban communist movement. Uprisings in Guangzhou, Changsha, and Nanchang were crushed. In the space of 20 days, more than 10,000 communists across China's southern provinces were arrested and summarily executed. All in all, in the year after April 1927, it is estimated that as many as 300,000 people died in the GMD's anti-communist extermination campaign. The only surviving fragments of the CCP were its rural bases among the peasantry. By the conclusion of the Long March 7 years later, the party had recomposed itself by recruiting peasants, expropriating land, and focusing its agitation on the long-standing tensions in the commercialized countryside, thereby expanding its rural base. Transformed into a peasant army, the new party ran only a marginal, underground urban wing after regaining national influence. As more and more territory fell under communist control in the 15 years between the Japanese invasion and the expulsion of the GMD via civil war, the CCP found itself taking control of urban areas in which it had little, if any, organic influence. Its linkage to its own urban past having been thoroughly severed by the nationwide massacres 20 years earlier. By this point, the party itself had been transformed, its organizational apparatus fundamentally fused to the operation of a peasant army and the requirements of rural administration. Having traveled its long road from city to countryside, the party now returned as a stranger. Foreign capital in the port cities. The cities to which the CCP returned in the course of the war were hardly the same as those it had left. Between 1902 and 1931, foreign investment had quadrupled. Prior to the Sino-Japanese War, in 1936, foreign capital is estimated to constitute 73.8% of China's total industrial capital. The vast majority of large-scale enterprises were funded by foreign investment. But even this amount of foreign investment did not initially amount to much. Surveys conducted by the GMD government found that between 1929 and 1933, only 250 units could be registered as modern factories. And in 1933, of the 18,708 private-owned factories, only 86% were enterprises of more than 1,000 workers. 16,273 had less than 30 workers. Not only did these modern factories represent a small portion of employment in China prior to the war, they also represented a modest fraction of industrial output despite their large share of industrial capital, only accounting for some 28%, with the remaining 72% produced by the small, often rural, handicraft workshops that compose the bulk of the country's pre-war industrial structure. This is not to say that pre-war Chinese industry in the cities was necessarily inefficient or outdated. Despite not being organized into large, centralized industrial conglomerates, China's own decentralized urban business networks composed of small enterprises and handicraft producers excelled in their ability to both be smoothly incorporated into foreign business ventures and to outcompete foreign goods in the domestic markets of the country's interior, as well as, in select instances, in international markets. Though dating back in some places to the southern Song and revived significantly under the Qing, these city-based production networks were by no means resistant to technological transformation. Handicraft production in the cities of the Qing and Republican periods was able to absorb new machine techniques while retaining its decentralized, small-scale, and networked character. Both the official GMD government and de facto independent warlords, such as Guangdong's Cheng Jitang, engaged in campaigns of industrialization in cities such as Guangzhou, Nanjing, and Chongqing, the nationalist wartime capital, but these campaigns seem to have mainly reinforced and expanded pre-existing production networks, bolstering them with new technological inputs rather than simply replacing them with more modernized factories. This networked, administratively distributed, and flexible industrial fabric was the basic building block of China's port cities, where coolie labor had become a central feature of both production itself and the myriad services required to keep the export industries functioning smoothly. The coolie labor was in many cases little more than slavery, similar to the forms of bondage used in capital's other frontiers. Early Chinese labor markets were especially adept at facilitating the deployment and sale of this labor, both into cities like Guangzhou and overseas, where coolies could be found cutting sugarcane on Cuban plantations, building railroads across the Rocky Mountains, and mining silver in Peru. Practices such as this clearly marked China's early transition to capitalism. This transition took a quasi-colonial form, with only small portions of the country directly subordinated to capitalist imperatives, even while international demand began to exert a strong gravitational pull on domestic production. The disciplining and selling of labor was integral to this process, but this did not take an immediately modern form. Instead, the Republican period had inherited the system of official supervision and merchant management. Designed for an era when merchants were distinct from the formal Confucian scholar ruling class, the Guangdu Shangban system subordinated the economic interests of merchants to the political interests of scholar officials. In the Republican period, the collapse of the imperial officialdom and the rise of significantly more powerful merchant entrepreneurs disrupted, but did not entirely overturn the practice. Numerous officials had since become entrepreneurs, while the bureaucracy of the GMD provided a new, albeit much transformed, official sanction for industrial development in an era of bureaucratic capitalism. This meant that the formal owners of factories and workshops, including Chinese capitalists, were rarely that interested in the details of their investments, so long as they continued to turn a profit. It was therefore common to hire third parties to act as technical and administrative managers. But even these managers were not directly responsible for production. Managers hired to produce profit were evaluated for results regardless of the means used to obtain them. They were the middlemen between workers and owners and their government allies. Loyalty to the owner was far more important than competence. Administrators, therefore, had to delegate primary authority for operations to skilled, experienced workers known as gang bosses. Much of the day-to-day labor in the factory or on the docks was in many ways self-managed by workers on site. These workers were organized into loose units, which themselves were yoked together in a decentralized hierarchy, with a gang boss, bateau, or labor contractor acting as the nodes in this network that were directly accessible to administrators. These administrators were foreign to the technical details of the work itself, not to mention that many were literally foreigners, incapable of even speaking to the workers at the bottom of the chain. All this was, of course, embroidered with the predictable brutality, in which rich managers would come to oversee their factories on velvet-cushioned sedan chairs carried by coolies. The managers paid monthly wages some 300 times those of the workers themselves. Alongside the gang boss and labor contractor, there were also guild masters and secret societies. Though often initially founded under the Qing as rebel organizations of one kind or another, under the nationalists, the guilds and secret societies took on the character of criminal rackets. Each also helped to shape the forms of labor deployment that would develop in this early period of capitalist integration. Guilds de-emphasized the art of the craft in favor of seeking lucrative contracts. They became fledgling capitalist construction companies whose managers, the guild masters hired people for wages that were quickly returned to the guild in the form of membership fees. Brutality in enforcing the guild's monopoly over hiring and construction was common. Secret societies, outlawed under the Qing, had helped staff the 1911 Republican Revolution, and in return, were permitted to operate openly for the first time. This fundamentally transformed the function of the secret society and ended the period in which they could be understood as primitive revolutionaries. Some remained faithful to their social bandit origins and joined the Communist Party, but the rest became run-of-the-mill reactionaries. They bore, for the remaining decades of the Republican period, a close resemblance to the Sicilian Mafia, operating as terrorist syndicates and shedding what elements of social banditry they once possessed. Their continued and mutually profitable liaison with the Kuomintang during the 1920s and 1930s earned them the reputation of hired assassins of the government, used against unarmed workers in Shanghai in 1927, and agents of the most corrupt and reactionary elements of the Nationalist Party. The influence of such groups grew in the vacuum created by the destruction of the communist labor unions and the party cells after 1927. The result was a city in which labor contractors, the gang boss system, the guilds, and the secret societies all formed a complex mesh of labor deployment defined by both the dependence on the wage and the threat of direct violence common in colonial regimes of accumulation. Aside from these port cities, China had only limited urban industrial projects in its interior, confined to isolated islands within the huge agricultural economy. These were usually established as attempts by government officials in the Qing and Republican periods to build military infrastructure capable of strengthening their respective provinces. Such industrial islands were largely self-sufficient, as were the few interior projects built by foreigners. The vast majority of industry was light industry located across a rural-urban continuum. It was not until the Japanese invasion that a truly modern industrial structure was constructed on the Chinese mainland. Rural Revolution. As the revolution moved into the rural sphere starting in the late 1920s, the CCP found it hard to organize in southern villages. The Republican state was able to intervene into rural social relations in the southern countryside in a way that it could not in the north. As many southern landlords had moved to the cities as absentee landlords in the late Imperial period, the state played a much bigger role in mediating class relations in southern villages, allowing it to penetrate local society and to coordinate the activities of different social groups and classes for its own purposes, without employing a despotic, coercive force. In the north, however, villages were less divided by class and more unified against state intrusion, especially since late Qing attempts to increase taxes on them. This geographic difference in state-society relations created more opportunity for the CCP to organize in the north during the war, where it worked and unified villages against the nationalists and Japanese. Exacerbating class differences, in other words, was not the most effective strategy for the CCP, and the village became the basic unit of mobilization efforts. This relationship was strengthened by the land and taxation policies of the CCP during the war. This success in the relatively unified northern villages became a model for the revolution. The party's new populism developed out of the social contradictions produced over the preceding decades by the uneven subsumption of the rural sphere within global capitalism. These conditions helped to create two contradictory political tendencies: a politics of class struggle, which responded to increased rural inequality and gentry's tightening control over rural surplus and markets, and a politics of national unity, which faced foreign invasion, imperialism, and subservience to foreign powers. While there were many moments of sharp class antagonism that played out during the revolution, the politics of national unity dominated in the revolutionary and much of the post-revolutionary periods. In this sense, the conditions of CCP politics mirrored that of the GMD, with its focus on national unity, although the CCP was better able to bridge the contradiction between these two politics with the concept of the people. A focus on national unity was incomplete and one-sided. The people, by contrast, was defined neither solely by national citizenship nor by one's class. Instead, one's subjective stance towards the revolution placed one within or outside of the people. Thus, even the national bourgeoisie, Chinese capitalists who did not collaborate directly with foreign powers, and patriotic rich peasants and landlords could become members of the people, as long as they threw their weight and resources behind the revolution. This focus on subjectivity would remain a strong component of CCP politics from the time on. The progress of land reform, entailing a series of campaigns and grassroots movements for the redistribution of land, ebbed and flowed with the politics of the party. In northern areas under party control before 1949, land reform began in 1946 as a civil war with the GMD was reignited. Initially, the party only gave approval for peasants who took land from landlords, but by 1947 it turned the egalitarian redistribution of land into a guiding principle. This initial process was ended in 1948 when the party decided it had been carried out in too radical a fashion. A more radical land reform process that eliminated the rural gentry only restarted after the CCP took power nationally, leading to a large-scale redistribution of land. Though often growing out of repeated peasant rebellions that had occurred independent of the party, the process itself involved party cadre identifying key active elements among the poor peasantry to lead the struggle against the landlord and rich peasant classes. This aimed to eliminate the rural exploiting classes, while at the same time cultivating an active group of local supporters. Such a two-pronged approach was crucial to building state power within the villages, since it gave the new administrative structures a local mandate. This process would also provide the seeds of a new class structure that would develop over the course of the socialist era, since the process entailed publicly categorizing villagers into 5 class categories, depending on their relationship to exploitation prior to the communist seizure of the territory. In North China, this process was more violent, as class divisions were aggravated in the previously more unified villages. Once the process was complete, a new village power structure emerged. In the south, the process was milder, with only surplus land redistributed from rich peasants. Most pre-war landlords were absentee, and thus did not live in the villages once land reform began. The guiding principles in the post-1949 land reform process were to increase production while also knocking out classes that could compete with the state for surplus. Despite the variation in methods, land holdings were largely equalized within villages across China. The vast majority of peasant families benefited, and the party obtained critical support. Officially, 300 million peasants gained land, and over 40% of land holdings were redistributed. The land holdings of those designated landlords dropped from 30% to 2%. This strengthened rural household production, with many peasant families now having direct access to the means of production for the first time. Land reform was basically completed by 1953, creating landholding equality at the village level, strengthening party control over the villages, and eliminating the rural gentry, a state rival in the extraction of rural surplus. By facilitating the process, the party had won a widespread popular mandate. Meanwhile, the rural economy recovered from a long wartime slump, producing a surplus that the new state now aimed to extract. Japanese Manchuria. The Japanese invasion had contradictory effects on the Chinese economy. First, it brought with it unparalleled destruction. The national transportation infrastructure built in the Qing and Republican periods was bombed to pieces. The newly created banking system, which had stabilized prices for the first time since the American silver buying program, quickly collapsed under the occupation. This resulted in desperate attempts to print banknotes to support war expenditures, initiating an inflationary crisis that would ultimately devastate the Republican economy. Faced with the destruction of the Southern Rice Belt, food commodities became scarce, and the country's 1 million industrial workers and 10 million handicraft workers were faced with unemployment and hyperinflated food prices. Much of this economic chaos continued into the Civil War era in zones under GMD control, and all of these problems would then be inherited by the CCP after its victory. But destruction was not the only inheritance. With the Pacific War looming, the Japanese made enormous investments in Manchuria and Taiwan, essentially constructing an entirely new industrial structure from the ground up in the space of a few years, the scale and scope of which far exceeded the investments made by foreign capitalists over the century prior. Combined, these Japanese-built manufacturing belts were twice as large as the entirety of China's pre-war industry. The productive geography of the East Asian mainland was thereby reformatted, with less dependence on ports and export zones, and much more of the new inland heavy industry producing for domestic, primarily military consumption. Meanwhile, the entire northeastern region saw a spate of urbanization that would not be matched in scale or speed until the 1980s. In 1910, Manchuria's city dwellers composed only 10% of its total population. By 1940, the urban population had doubled. Many of these new residents were themselves migrants from other parts of North China and would frequently return to their villages after completing a work assignment, facilitated by the Japanese railway and steamship networks. In contrast to the decentralized, small-scale industrial networks of the port cities, the Japanese manufacturing zone was large-scale, vertically integrated, and thoroughly incorporated into the bureaucracy of wartime production. The factory structures attempted to mimic the massive Taylorist conglomerates of the U.S. industrial belt, with capital-intensive enterprises based on the most advanced machines, all operated by cheap Chinese labor and almost feudal labor management. Early on in the region's development, more skilled Japanese labor was also used, but even this soon gave way as the Japanese trained cheaper Chinese technicians to take their place. These Chinese workers were, in Manchuria as elsewhere, procured by gang bosses or labor contractors, who would receive a total sum of wages from the Japanese employers and distribute them to the workers as they saw fit, reserving a large cut for themselves. But whereas the gang boss system used in the southern port cities saw gang bosses, in competition with guilds and other contractors, commanding smaller networks of labor recruits who were dispatched to much smaller enterprises, these modern Japanese factories required labor deployment on an entirely different scale. Many used only a small number of bateaux, who supplied and managed several thousand workers. This management was distributed down a vertically integrated hierarchy of gang bosses, with number 3 bateau at the bottom commanding squads of about 15 workers. At the same time, the gang boss hierarchy was itself buffered by an extensive bureaucracy, with other functionaries as well, such as Xian Sheng or Sensei, who was clerk, accountant, and paymaster, cooks, and runners. Below all of this were the workers, seen as temporary and even worse off casuals, who didn't have the protection of a gang boss. The non-casual workers were paid wages, often daily, and were provided with certain additional handouts by the gang bosses, including food, housing, medical care, protection, and recreational activities. Wages themselves were often scaled according to the workers' origins, with migrants being paid only 2/3 of what local workers received. In some instances, such as at the Fushun coal mines, workers were hired and paid by the enterprise directly, but the work was still supervised by gang bosses operating the capacity of labor administrators. At a higher level, the management of the entire region had a Taylorist character, with experts such as Wada Toshio, director of the Daito Psychology Institute of Hiroshima, shipped in to test workers' aptitude, increase their efficiency, and standardize production. Faced with a labor shortage toward the beginning of the 1940s, the Japanese soon turned to more coercive means of recruitment. This included forcing students, prisoners, vagrants, and the floating population of unemployed or casual workers into largely unpaid and compulsory labor service, all formalized by the April 1940 National Army Law, which sought universal conscription into the military and industrial development projects. Those not pulled into the army itself were sent to the National Labor Corps, between the ages of 20 and 23, to work in military construction, essential industries, or local production. The brutality of this labor regime is not to be underestimated, and has been quite fairly compared to the European Holocaust in the scale and scope of its devastation. Throughout this period, then, attempts to rationalize and modernize labor deployment through the implementation of Taylorist methods and the use of hourly wages coexisted with and were ultimately superseded by regimes that relied, in the last instance, on the threat of violence, whether this be at the hand of the gang boss or through the revival of systems of corvée labor and tributary methods of production and trade. This bore degrees of similarity to various forms of pre-capitalist accumulation seen throughout Eurasia, and authors writing on the Manchurian labor system have sloppily referred to it as feudal, More importantly, these feudal aspects of the labor regime are often portrayed as being in tension with a properly rational Taylorist system of labor deployment through the wage relation. But this opposition is not so clear. Despite its allegedly feudal elements, the Japanese industrialization of the Chinese mainland can well be seen as the initiation of a transition to an explicitly capitalist mode of production dominated by value production. Rather than seeing the buildup of the Japanese wartime complex, or its German, Italian, or American counterparts, as driven by simple military madness, we must understand these military expansions as necessities of accumulation posed by states facing limits to their growth and mired in crisis of value production. The Japanese colonization of the mainland was a response to a crisis of global capitalism. In one sense, this can be understood as a process of primitive accumulation, but only if we sever the term from the connotations of an expanding commercial capitalism, circa the European gestation of the capitalist mode of production in its Genoese, Dutch, or British sequences. Japanese entry into Manchuria marked an attempt to move from the simple colonial practice of capitalist firms operating mainly through archaic, pre-capitalist modes of labor organization at low and generally stagnant levels of technique, a slight simplification for China, but largely consistent with how things worked in the port cities, into large-scale, highly mechanized and coordinated industrial enterprises capable of increasing productivity and thereby generating relative surplus value, rather than simply harvesting more absolute surplus value from more workers. The proceeds of this process were intended to be exchanged and invested across the growing domestic and international markets, both of which the Japanese were actively reconstructing. The Japanese scaling up of the gang boss system and the implementation of forced labor were not, then, in any way a form of backsliding into pre-capitalist modes of production. They were instead a capitalist logic of production taken to its extreme, literally a last-ditch effort to preserve the capitalist social relations that ensured the continued accumulation of value on the East Asian mainland. Compounding growth rates, the increasing circulation of commodities across the domestic market, and the beginning of the urban demographic transition all followed, alongside the mass proletarianization of ex-peasant migrants. These forms of labor deployment were in fact the ultimate complement to the Taylorist rationalization campaigns, because, in the face of labor shortage and military defeats, it was only these forms of labor deployment that worked, or more accurately, got people working. The industrial inheritance. After this Japanese military complex collapsed under Soviet and American offensives in 1945, the capital fixed in Manchuria was transferred to GMD state ownership. This industrial structure was predominantly geared toward the production of electricity. 63% of the country's electrical industry was state-owned by the GMD after the Japanese defeat, produced by plants seized from the retreating Japanese, and primary industrial materials, steel and iron 90%, tungsten 100%, tin 70%, cement 45%. The total value of state industrial capital had increased 100-fold in 10 years, from 318 million yuan in 1936 to 3,161 million yuan in 1946, when it composed 67.3% of the total industrial capital. The GMD was utterly unable to manage this vast new bureaucracy. Incapable of reining in inflation, the dire economic trends initiated under the Japanese continued under the nationalists, who were ill-suited to restart the project of imperial expansion begun by their predecessors. The middle class that had started to form prior to the invasion was now all but liquidated. A new bureaucratic warlordism arose alongside and within the collapsing GMD, creating nearly perfect conditions for growth of the communist armies in the countryside. As the GMD began to cede territory to the CCP in the Civil War, this Japanese-built state industrial structure was the most intact component of non-agricultural production that the communists inherited. Manchuria was conquered early on with substantial military assistance from Russia, which gave significant amounts of ammunition, artillery, tanks, and aircraft to the Communist Army, while also assisting in the reconstruction of the Manchurian railroad system. But this assistance also came at significant cost, as Stalin ordered Russian troops to partner with the GMD and loot Manchurian factories in order to recuperate the USSR's own war-strained industry. It was in Manchuria, then, that the CCP first confronted the question of industrialization and urbanization that would become increasingly central to the socialist era. This meant not only that the party had to find ways of overcoming technical hurdles, since its urban wing could not supply the necessary trained cadres to deal with getting urban production going again, but also that it had to fuse its urban and rural wings, which had previously operated with relative autonomy. The urban wing, headed by Louis Shaoqi, had been engaged in clandestine activity during GMD control and Japanese occupation, necessitating that their organization stress secrecy, highly regulated chains of command, and tight discipline. When the urban wing was given responsibility for wartime production and the first stages of communist-led industrialization, it was still operating under an extensively regimented command structure designed for clandestine activity. The problems with this were recognized, but there was no alternative at hand. Even where workers themselves could step in to keep the machinery running after Japanese and GMD managers had fled, the urban wing of the party was the only remaining force capable of coordinating production across the factories and managing distribution of this product beyond the geographically concentrated belt of heavy industry in Manchuria. The decisions confronted there, more than anywhere else, cut to the root of the communist project. If the party were to simply seize the industrial infrastructure built by the Japanese, they risked reigniting the brutal expansionary process for which these industries were built and reconstructing the bureaucracy necessary to keep them running. Even if the party devolved direct control of these industries to the remaining workers trained to run them, this would have done nothing to solve the structural problems inherent in how these large-scale factories functioned, nor the challenge posed by their geographical concentration. The gang boss hierarchy could be filled with elected representatives, but this would have simply replaced a more Darwinian bureaucracy with a democratic one. In other words, the industrial infrastructure of Manchuria was not a politically neutral engine of production that could simply be seized and driven to better ends. On the contrary, the entirety of its logistical networks, its uneven geography, and its basic factory-level organization, ranging from physical construction to administration, were designed precisely to suck migrant laborers into the new urban industrial core, severing them from their own means of subsistence and forcing them to rely on various strata of management for their own reproduction, whether through wages or gang boss-provided housing and medical care. This doesn't mean, of course, that this infrastructure was inherently bad or inherently useless for a communist project, but simply that the gains of modern technology and increased productivity were closely alloyed with these limits. The problem was how, precisely, to utilize the productive capacity of this inherited infrastructure while simultaneously transforming society's relations of production, a transformation that can only occur at a scale much larger than the individual enterprise, and which is in no way produced by a linear agglomeration of small changes made in individual workers' relationships to individual workplaces, though these are obviously important and occur at every stage in the process. It was only confronting this larger problem, then, that the party's own theories of industrial organization would become relevant. These top-down theories, meanwhile, were often paired with the bottom-up activity of workers in these industries, whose own opinions on these questions contributed to the overall heterogeneity of the communist project, which was by no means reducible to the CCP. The next 3 decades would be marked by struggles over the transformation and expansion of this industrial inheritance, with the party absorbing many of these heterogeneous positions in the securing of a strategic hegemony, a hegemony premised on the potentials of production. The urban divide. Despite the country's peasant majority and its rural revolutionary base, it was the cities that became central in the attempt to expand the gains of modernization beyond the borders of Manchuria and the southern ports. This would knit together the industrial archipelago into a true national economy for the first time in the region's history, while simultaneously creating a major beachhead in the hoped-for transition to a global communist society. At the second plenary of the 7th Central Committee of the CCP in March 1949, Mao declared that, quote, "the center of gravity of the party's work has shifted from the village to the city," end quote. But the industrial islands of the cities proved to be serious obstacles, not so much the construction of the national economy. In fact, they would prove to be dangerous accelerants, but instead to the construction of anything approximating a communist project in the 20th century. The socialist era was indeed a time of transition, in which a national economy was gradually sewn together out of disparate economic subregions and various methods of labor deployment. But the most fundamental characteristics of this national economy, the one feature that could be said to span city and countryside, determining the relationship between the two, was the implementation of the grain standard and the net funneling of resources from countryside to city. In other words, the linchpin of the entire development project was the widening of the urban-rural divide, despite the increase of the country's total social wealth. The basic riddle posed by the existence of the city was as follows. How was it possible to implement an agrarian revolution to cheapen the basic cost of life, allowing for an equality that was not equality in scarcity in the world's poorest country, without also undermining the basis of that egalitarian project by privileging geographically concentrated industrial zones and generating new hierarchies through urbanization? To put this in perspective, we need only remember that the East Asian mainland, at the time of its revolution, was one of the most underdeveloped regions in the world. Compared to China in 1943, Russia in 1913, itself a largely undeveloped agrarian country on the eve of its revolution, already manufactured 3 times as many tons of steel, twice as many tons of iron, had twice as many kilometers of railways, and produced 30 times as much petroleum. All of this is in absolute, rather than per capita terms, not taking into account the strikingly larger Chinese population. Of this population, very few people were employed in modern urban industries. Up until the early 1950s, less than 2% of China's population were workers and employees. The vast majority were peasants. Urbanization is no simple problem. Theories of the city are often unabashedly saturated by ideology. The most popular is a commercialization model of capitalist development, which portrays capitalism as an inevitable outgrowth of human nature, and also generally assumes that cities are from the beginning capitalism in embryo. This implies that towns were by nature antithetical to feudalism, so that their growth, however it came about, undermined the foundations of the feudal system. This model also tends to infer that cities are, in fact, antithetical to any mode of production other than capitalism, and that all forms of urbanization are inherently capitalist. In reality, capitalism has not been the only mode of production that saw major processes of urbanization. Nevertheless, it is often simply assumed that the abolition of capitalism entails the abolition of the city, and the explosion of industry into a garden city of fields, factories, and workshops, in which population itself must be roughly equalized across inhabited territory. Marx and Engels' own work exacerbates this confusion. The more equitable distribution of the population over towns and countries is one of the 10 measures advanced in the Communist Manifesto. Though this can be understood as a response to the particular rural-urban inequalities that had arisen in Europe at the time, it is then made ahistorical in The Origin of the Family, where Engels claims the city as a basic characteristic of civilization, and thereby an origin point for all early class structures. In the early years of the Chinese socialist era, a similar principle would quickly be enshrined in official documents, mirroring the language of the manifesto. Little attention was given to the fact that, contrary to the European standard observed by Marx and Engels, the East Asian mainland already had a highly equitable distribution of population over town and country. The policy was written to respond to a problem that only barely existed, and the result was that every attempt to create the conditions whereby the distinction between town and country might be abolished tended to widen the inequality between the two. But the recognition of the problem also ensured that urbanization itself would soon be halted, effectively doubling the divide by fixing more of the population in the underfunded countryside. The urban divide was therefore exacerbated by all attempts to escape it. New democracy, old economy. Though confronted early on in Manchuria, the question of the city was only foregrounded with the end of the Civil War, as all of China's major urban areas fell to the Revolutionary Army, save those in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Previously, the problem posed by urban industry had been either partially solved or temporarily postponed by the war. The cities of the north and northeast became hubs for wartime production, necessitating both high levels of employment and a more complete takeover of these industries from the previous owners, be they private capitalist or Japanese and GMD bureaucrats. In these earlier liberated areas, many private enterprises were in fact run by workers after being abandoned by their former owners and all or most of their management personnel. The same was largely true of the state-owned industries in the early stages of wartime production, prior to the import of Soviet managers and technicians. The situation changed, however, upon the completion of the Civil War. In the later liberated southern port cities, many owners and managers remained present, leveraging previous technical skills and access to foreign credit in exchange for favorable treatment by the party. More importantly, victory in the war meant that the communists had seized several of the country's largest urban areas precisely when the wartime stimulus of these cities' industries was faltering and the U.S.-backed economic blockade had just begun. The number of workers and wartime refugees skyrocketed, but many of the industries in the coastal cities had been bombed by the Japanese or sabotaged by the retreating GMD. In Guangzhou alone, it was reported in December 1949 that less than a quarter of the city's enterprises were operating at full capacity, while nearly a third of the entire workforce was unemployed. These unemployed workers had themselves contributed significantly to the communist victory. Rather than being the unwilling subjects of a new regime, the toppling of the Japanese and then the GMD had been actively pushed for by many workers. Throughout the 1930s, periodic strike waves had rolled through occupied territory, the result of both clandestine communist activity and a wide-ranging, if disorganized, workers' movement. After the Japanese transferred power to the GMD, the strikes only increased, with more than 3 million workers taking part in strikes in 1947 alone. Hearing of the communist land reform programs in the countryside and factory seizures in the north, many workers were inspired to action against the GMD in the hopes that the brutal management techniques, low wages, and arrogant hierarchies with which they were familiar would be overturned through the direct takeover of the southern industries. But while the party concentrated on land reform in the countryside, the immediate task in the city became the revival of production. If they could not get the factories running again, there would be no way to modernize agriculture, leaving the peasantry to its historical cycle of population growth, pockmarked by famine and mercantile expansion. More pressingly, there was a problem with the urban unemployed, who were themselves underfed and housed in abysmal conditions, with many urbanites literally living in the rubble left by 20 years of almost constant war. An outflow of population from rural war zones had both bloated the urban population and undercut the country's capacity for food production. The result was that the heavily populated cities were, in 1949, reliant on imports of consumer goods and food, and many residents were housed in informal slums. As the international blockade of the victorious communists began, the country was quickly starved of the necessary imports. If people in China were to rebuild their cities, they would need to produce their own concrete, steel, electricity, and most importantly, grain to feed the workers at every stage of this process. If, on the other hand, the cities were to be partially abandoned in favor of resettling the countryside in an attempt to build some sort of agrarian socialism, it was unclear how the war-torn country would escape immediate famine, a renewed expansion of commercial activity leading to another era of warlordism, or its direct counterpart, foreign invasion, a threat that loomed large as the Americans began to occupy much of the territory that the Japanese had seized decades prior. Maybe more importantly, such an option would likely have led to the severing of freshly renewed ties with the USSR, one of China's only sources for international aid and technical training, not to mention the largest military threat bordering China. Nonetheless, attempts at agrarian forms of socialism were not without precedent, as anarchists, Republicans, and communists alike had advocated and even attempted to build such egalitarian rural projects in the past, particularly in the New Village, rural reconstruction, and village cooperation movements of the early 20th century. Some, such as the Tolstoyan anarchist Louis Juppé, envisioned the end goal of any egalitarian project in China to be anti-modern in character, returning the country to its agrarian heritage. Many of the CCP's earliest members had emerged from the anarchist movement and retained more than a little fidelity to decentralized models of development that mixed industrial and agricultural activity and thereby encouraged outmigration from urban cores. Though this latter option may seem absurd, given the party's intellectual dedication to a truncated Marxism and some of the worst features of high Stalinism, it should be remembered how greatly the communist program had already diverged in the countryside from the Soviet path. The Chinese attachment to Stalinist practices, and especially the theoretical justifications for these practices, was more the product of an expedient pragmatism than any naive belief in the infallibility of the Russian model. Readings of Chinese socialist history often unduly privilege the role of theory and ideology in the decisions of an era that was in fact marked by immense unevenness and continual, if failed, experimentation. Here, however, we emphasize that a society's basic material conditions and the objective limits posed by them are primary to any Marxist understanding of history. This isn't to say that the ideological inheritance of the Chinese communists was irrelevant. We will see only how crippling it was, but simply to point out that the limits facing the Chinese Communist project in the 20th century were not primarily limits of imagination. To return to the example above, had there been strong material pull factors offering people a better life in a peacetime countryside, it is likely that there would have been outward population pressure back into rural areas, not at all unprecedented in the history of the region's cities, and the party would have had to either somehow restrain or accommodate this tendency. The preeminent fact, however, was that the agrarian abundance was not forthcoming. The cities were in ruins. The industries in the Northeast were slightly more intact, run in this period by workers more or less directly, but the majority of these workers had never been allowed access to the higher order technical skills needed for complex repairs, modernization, or inter-factory coordination. On top of this, there was little to no infrastructure designed to bring the gains of this northeastern heavy industry to the rest of the country. The railway system was severed in thousands of places, there were no national highways, and the party had inherited little in the way of a merchant marine, with the U.S. threatening to sink outbound Chinese ships regardless. In the port cities, many enterprises had been severely damaged, but their owners and managers had often not fled with the retreating nationalists. This urban bourgeoisie, whose members possessed literacy, technical knowledge, and business experience vital to urban production, were the CCP's chief urban political rival. The smaller average size of the port city enterprises also meant that the local elite were not at all a class of even consistency, with small owners, administrators, and technical experts distributed along a complex, decentralized hierarchy of production. Some were little more than skilled workers, while others had been influential gang bosses aspiring toward their own dockside fiefdom. A much smaller segment were unambiguously domestic capitalists, often retaining access to restricted streams of credit from the West. The repair of factories, mobilization of worker networks, and day-to-day running of production was entirely dependent on the technical and managerial skills spread across this hierarchy. The restructuring of the economy was coordinated by three main actors. First, there was the military, which sent representatives, who were also party members, to individual factories where they claimed the authority of the new government. But these military representatives were not particularly familiar with industrial production and, therefore, had to rely on the hierarchy of technicians and administrators already in place. Secondly, there was the urban wing of the CCP itself, many members of which were skilled workers. Nonetheless, the party's urban wing was small and accustomed to operating within a rigid command hierarchy necessitated by secrecy, whereas the rural party's experience mediating between simultaneous social conflicts and administrating large swaths of production had made it a flexible and adaptable organization. The urban party's experience had been far more limited. Finally, there were the skilled, literate workers who, with the blessings of the Communist Party, were quickly promoted to positions of leadership in the factories by the trade unions. But these workers were sparse, due to widespread illiteracy among both urban residents and the majority of the CCP cadre. In Shanghai alone, the illiteracy rate for all employees, including clerks and white-collar workers, was estimated at 46%. Meanwhile, among blue-collar factory workers, This figure is much higher, probably near the 80% figure for industrial personnel in the whole country. By contrast, in 1949, almost all the students in Chinese universities and higher-level technical schools were from the urban middle and upper middle classes, and these students were no longer simply elites educated in the Confucian classics. Instead, well over half, 63%, of the members of this group who were university and technical school graduates in 1949 had majored in subjects that were essential for industrialization. The party's response was to launch a recruitment drive, hoping to bolster its ranks with loyal intellectuals and skilled technicians. The risk of careerism and corruption was clearly noted, but these were considered necessary evils that could later be uprooted. Meanwhile, new unions were formed alongside the new party organs, intended to simultaneously rationalize production and provide workers with some oversight over the new, less trustworthy party recruits. At first, the party had attempted to weed out former gang bosses, GMD union thugs, and secret society members from its restructured industrial system, but this proved to be nearly impossible, and the attempt only further stalled the recuperation of industry. Local cadre were instructed to open recruitment in the new unions, hoping that workers' own political perceptiveness, combined with state-sponsored reform campaigns, would be sufficient to prevent these lower-tier elites from regaining power. Higher up the chain, however, the party's policy was conciliatory. There was a need not only to retain the technical knowledge of mid- and lower-level elites, but also to acquire new fixed capital investments in order to rebuild and expand industrial production. With the economic blockade restricting the import of fixed capital and access to international lending, only the remaining urban bourgeoisie had the type of connections necessary to acquire the key imports and credit necessary for rebuilding. The result was a managerial system that, in certain ways, greatly resembled that of the port cities prior to the war. By 1953, approximately 80% of the managerial personnel were of bourgeois background, and 37% of these were pre-1949 graduates, returned overseas Chinese students, or factory owners. One key difference was the widespread presence of the party, but its numbers were still small. Though recruitment had expanded, by 1953 only 20% or so of managerial and technical personnel was made up of urban Communist Party members, promoted workers, or directors and trade union officials appointed directly by the party. Meanwhile, strikes had risen to an all-time high, and many capitalists had responded by simply closing any of their factories that still functioned, firing the workers, and waiting to see whether they should take what they could and flee. The party developed a two-pronged recovery policy. First, it signed under the Sino-Soviet Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance Treaty in early 1950, giving the Russians certain privileges in Manchuria and securing a $300 million loan for the rebuilding of industry. This was considered unambiguously necessary. The Soviets provided a relatively strong and absolutely vital international ally, given the U.S. embargo and military blockade of the eastern seaboard, and the complete absence of any overland routes between China and other industrial nations. Of equal importance, perhaps, was the patronage of the world's only nuclear power outside the U.S. in an era when General MacArthur was reported to be threatening China and Korea with nuclear attacks. Soon after the treaty was signed, the USSR began sending the first wave of technicians into China, particularly to the northeast, tasked with getting production up and running again, as well as training a new generation of Chinese engineers. The second component of the recovery plan was a coexistence policy laid out in the Common Program. Formulated in late 1949, the program was solidified in the years of war and political consolidation that followed. It aimed to complete the bourgeois revolution in the cities, utilizing the elements of capitalism that were beneficial and not harmful to the national economy. In other words, to control, not to eliminate, capitalism. What this meant was effectively the appeasement of the remaining urban capitalists, who would be gradually bought out of their own industries by the state in exchange for offering their technical expertise to the project of industrial recovery and development. The size of the private sector in this period was significant. Though it composed only 55.8% of the gross output value of industry as a whole, private production was some 85% of total retail sales, making it central to the circulation of goods. At the same time, the party sought to cultivate and utilize the productivity of the private sector. However, it also sought to contain its volatility. Communist policy in the stage was to fight against speculative activity on the one hand, while at the same time aiding the development of normal private business. The Shanghai Stock Exchange was closed, and all government funds were concentrated in the state banks. This slowed production, causing the closure of private banks and 1 out of every 10 commercial establishments. The party responded with a massive stimulus, with the state placing orders at guaranteed prices for privately produced goods and giving special wholesale price differentials to large commercial enterprises in order to encourage the flow of goods across the domestic market. The outbreak of the Korean War secured this relationship, as the demand for military supplies skyrocketed. Business was so good that many leading industrialists who had previously withdrawn their capital from China now gained confidence in communist policy and returned, bringing with them new capital and technical staff. Of the revenues generated by the new industrial boom in the port cities, the state took an increasingly large share in the form of taxes, which would soon be used as a basis for new waves of state-led industrialization. The growth in the private sector in this period was robust enough to reignite fears about an uncontrollable continuation of the transition to capitalism already underway, in which commercial energies would overspill the party's attempts to control them. Therefore, after land reform was complete and the banking system fully nationalized, the state began to restrict private industry with the launching of the Five Anti-campaign in January 1952, which attempted to unleash pent-up worker rage against their employers in a way that would facilitate the beginning of industrial nationalization. Channeling unrest. Many urban workers had felt disappointed or betrayed by the continuation of capitalism in the port cities, and the early 1950s saw a slow increase in industrial agitation. The new state responded to this dissatisfaction in several ways. First, concessions were given to many workers, wages increased, and most urbanites' livelihoods were significantly improved. Not necessarily a difficult task, since peace alone was an improvement on 2 decades of war and occupation. Second, new mass organizations were created, including new unions and a national labor board, in an attempt to provide less economically disruptive means to solve workplace grievances. Though these new organizations often proved clunky and unresponsive, they were still initially seen as an important tool for the reorganization of industry and for the devolution of more power to the workers. Finally, when wages and other concessions could no longer be increased, and the new unions risked sparking another explosive seizure of power by the workers, the party responded with a democratic reform movement, followed by the 3 and 5 anti-movements, intended to begin the reform of industry and scour the new industrial system for traces of corruption and infiltration by old gang bosses, secret society members, and nationalist sympathizers seeking to restore the power they had lost by becoming incorporated into the developing party state. At the height of the Five Anti-campaign, millions of workers and employees were mobilized to denounce their employers, and one result of the many public denunciations of capitalists was a great increase in suicides of businessmen. This was essentially an extension of land reform methods to the cities, conceding to worker anger and at the same time providing windfall profits in the new state, which seized over $1.7 billion in the form of fines on private enterprises for having engaged in various illegal transactions. This also meant that the working capital of private enterprises dropped accordingly until private enterprises were largely reduced to empty shells. While successful in restraining the workers from a direct seizure of power and in crippling the influence of private capital, these programs led to a dip in production as workers and union cadre were constantly mobilized in attacks against their employers, and enterprises were stripped of their working capital countrywide. The Five Anti-movement, at its height, caused a number of enterprises to cease operations and interfere with production in many others, while also setting a dangerous precedent for giving workers power over their managers and enterprise owners. Fearing economic stagnation and renewed demands for a seizure of enterprises by workers, the party began rolling back the reform movement. At the same time, it reoriented the economy around the state, creating an entire commercial infrastructure to replace the curtailed markets of the private sector. This period saw a massive increase in the number of state corporations and retail stores. By the end of 1952, there were over 30,000 state stores throughout the country, or 4.7 times that of 1950. The party fused rural supply and marketing cooperatives with new urban consumers cooperatives, state stores, and other co-ops into a single socialist commercial network, tripling the total retail sales controlled by state commerce and increasing the sales of cooperative commerce fivefold between 1950 and 1952. The effect was as pronounced in retail as it was in wholesale trade, with the influence of co-ops and state-owned enterprises tripling in each sector. Foreign trade, meanwhile, was almost entirely handed over to the state, which by 1952 controlled 93% of all international commerce. In all of this, it's important to remember that the gains of the early 50s were widely accepted. Despite disappointment and agitation, most workers limited their attacks to the enterprise level. There were few true strike waves in these years, and the party retained the trust of a vast majority of the population. The Five Anti-campaign in 1952 is generally regarded as a high point of the influence of both workers and unions in private industry, since workers' direct control of their own enterprises increased alongside comparable increases in wages, social welfare, and general livelihoods. Per capita food consumption in the cities hit a peak between 1952 and 1955, with 241 kilograms of grain consumed per person per year in 1952 and 242 kilograms in 1953. These numbers dropped off slowly for the rest of the 1950s, then catastrophically during the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1960, and hereafter GLF, after which per capita food consumption would not rise above 240 kilograms again until 1986. The era of new democracy then was not primarily caused by, or even significantly defined by, the mechanical ideology that the party leadership used to justify it. It was a pragmatic response to several simultaneous material limits in the communist project, in which collaboration with the remaining capitalists was seen, correctly or not, as necessary. Meanwhile, concessions were made to workers in exchange for their limited endorsement of the policy, concessions that included workers' own involvement in the expulsion and often suicide of many of their employers. This period of urban industrial development, paired with the land reform era in the countryside, can therefore be seen as a momentary continuation of the transition to capitalism that had been abandoned and restarted several times over in the country's recent history. The party understood it as such, designating this period as the completion of the bourgeois revolution in the port cities. This gave the phenomenon a neat fit within the determinist mythology of high Stalinism, but this fit was simply the use of available theoretical resources to justify pragmatic action as it was underway. Theoretical fidelity to Stalinism was, if anything, the result rather than the cause of the industrial trends seen in the immediate years following the end of the Civil War. Nations to state. The first few years after 1949 were also a period in which the party was allowed time to experiment with its own forms of industrial administration and prepare for the halting the capitalist transition, the expropriation of the urban elites, and the implementation of a nationwide educational system open to people regardless of class background. The Northeast had fallen under the control of the revolutionaries early on, and much of its industrial structure was transferred directly to management by workers, followed by Soviet technicians, paired with ownership by the state. It was therefore one of the first regions in which experiments with non-capitalist forms of production were initiated. At the same time, Manchuria was a name for a problem of geography. Industrial goods had to not only be produced, something that worker self-management was certainly capable of, but also distributed countrywide to reconstruct war-ravaged cities, build housing for millions of slum-dwelling urbanites, and modernize agriculture. The electrical system had to be extended to the rest of the country. Railroads and highways had to be constructed, and schools and medical facilities had to be built, staffed, and stocked nationwide. The party and the military were the only two nationwide organizations still in existence after the completion of the Civil War. This meant that they were the only available means of coordination, distribution, and day-to-day facilitation of production. These problems would ultimately lead to the complete fusion of the party and the state over the course of the socialist era. But this was by no means the only possible outcome. In fact, the path of least resistance seemed to point in a very different direction. Historically, holders of power in previous dynasties had found it much easier to govern at a distance. For a region as large and diverse as mainland East Asia, this strategy proved, for millennia, to be both cheaper and more effective than its alternatives. Former dynasties had overseen military activity, cultivated the upper tiers of the bureaucracy, and ensured the construction of large-scale infrastructural projects. But beyond this, the reach of the state rarely extended all the way down. It was precisely this phenomenon of local quasi-statelessness that had made anarchism seem, early on, to be the most promising revolutionary path, since it corresponded most closely to the actuality of social existence. Previous states, though technically enormous in terms of geography and population, were in most ways only minimally connected to the places and people under their domain. The vast majority of the population, after all, lived their lives with next to no relationship with the state, whose functionaries almost never reached the village level, and whose levies and regulations were for the most part administered by members of the local elite, with tiers to their communities that were many and varied. People's lives are marked by various forms of community and solidarity: self-help, religious, ceremonial, clan-based, labor cycle, and market network related. And these forms of solidarity had made many communities capable of resistance and mobilization in the face of external threats, including imperial authoritarian overreach. Many anarchists had hoped to strengthen these local forms of resistance into an egalitarian revolutionary movement aimed at expanding the potentials of statelessness already present in Chinese village culture. These attempts, however, were systematic failures. Several of the most prominent anarchists in China, including Li Shizheng, Wu Jihui, Chang Ji, and Chang Jinjiang, ultimately joined and had leading roles within the Nationalist Party, sitting on its central committee and forming close relationships with Chiang Kai-shek and other members of the GMD's right wing. Those that retained their belief in an egalitarian and essentially communist revolution, faced with the failures of anarchism, flocked to the newly founded CCP. The failures of the early 20th century anarchist movement and the long history of quasi-stateless forms of exploitation led many of these young radicals to adopt strategies aimed instead at breaking the dynastic heritage through the construction of a strong state. Unlike the imperial state's hands-off approach to local government, however, the new state would extend all the way down to the common people, who would become its basic constituents. This state would thereby become increasingly transparent and porous, its activities visible and accessible at the local level. Anarchist ideals were marginally preserved in this vision, which would see local self-organization incorporated into the basic functioning of a new form of government. The populist category of the people would be made concrete via its immediate fusion with its administrative apparatus, making the state itself communal. At the same time, the USSR was taken as an emblematic, if deeply flawed, example of a non-capitalist system that had been capable of surviving in relative isolation, warding off both military invasion and economic embargo. The bureaucracy and brutality that accompanied internal changes of power within the USSR were by no means invisible to the Chinese communists. Many had, after all, pleaded with the Comintern to support them in breaking ties with the nationalists in the early 1920s, only to have their pleas first rejected and then horribly vindicated, as they were forced to watch their friends and loved ones be systematically slaughtered. Nonetheless, the USSR was the only worldly example of a modern society that was also substantially non-capitalist. Maybe more importantly, it was also the only industrial nation with which China shared an accessible overland border. This made it both a military threat and basically the only option for international aid to assist development. This relationship would become increasingly important as the U.S. instituted its embargo of the Chinese seaboard. Questions of the construction of a national economy and an accompanying national state were also one of the few places where the theoretical and empirical resources at hand did have an earnestly distorting effect on the party's strategy. Growing out of the material failure of anarchist and liberal projects, the only alternative revolutionary path was increasingly seen as entailing the construction of a national economy that would act as an early beachhead in the global communist revolution. But the connection between the National Development Project and the subsequent global revolution was dim at best. Though a strategy began to form around the construction of a new Chinese national polity, no strategy was immediately forthcoming for how an embattled and embargoed China might assist in the spread of global revolution. There were plenty of material factors hemming in decisions during this period. The Chinese population was underfed, underarmed, and had been surrounded by nearly constant war for an entire generation. A continuation of that war to liberate more territory beyond pre-existing national borders was not immediately feasible. The Korean War was, in fact, a test of this capacity, as the Chinese came to the aid of the Koreans and fought the U.S. military to a standstill. Though China's half-starving army of illiterate peasants was able to hold off the most advanced military in the world, the risks of the military endeavor were enormous, and its outcome basically precluded further international expansion. On top of this, the CCP had itself been reformatted by its years in the Chinese countryside. Previously, the leading minds of the party, such as Chen Duxui and Wang Ming, had been unambiguously internationalist, and had leveled critiques against rising nationalist trends within the party itself. Many of the party's rank and file were, in this period, laborers and trade unionists in the port cities, their everyday lives marked by cosmopolitan contact with workers, technicians, and revolutionaries of various leanings from all over the world, but especially Europe and the colonies of Southeast Asia. At the same time, leaders like Chen and Wang were obstinate dogmatists, over-attached to the decision of the Russian-dominated Comintern, blind to the failings of the USSR, firm believers in the universality of its path to revolution, dismissive of the pre-existing, large-scale social conflicts of the Chinese countryside, and dedicated to the most mechanical and naively optimistic Marxism. The result was their attempts at urban insurrection failed. Their willing subordination to the Comintern resulted in an unpopular and ultimately disastrous alliance with the nationalists, and the first incarnation of the party was essentially destroyed. An ancillary result of this, however, was that the party's leading internationalists were discredited, demoted, and replaced by figures whose strategy envisioned a much more primary role for the project of national development relative to international expansion in the communist revolution. This is not to say that Mao or others were purely interested in Chinese national development, or that they had no international strategy. But whereas the old CCP was formed in an era of international revolution, when the overturning of regimes in the heart of Europe still seemed plausible, the new CCP emerged into a world crushed under the heel of reactionary empires, in which the most hopeful revolutionary movements had been dismembered, and the militaries of imperial countries were bloated with war. The nationalist leanings of the new CCP cannot, however, be purely reduced to the theoretical or strategic inclinations of its leadership. Mass support for the party's hegemony of the communist project transformed the project itself. Based among an illiterate, largely land-bound peasantry, speaking often incommunicable dialects, there is no inherently cosmopolitan or global advantage innate to the party's new base of support. At the same time, no ancient, distinctively Chinese culture or political entity extended back into the murky depths of history. The egalitarian project was understood as the linking together, for once, of regionally distinct, disparate nations into an equitable political entity of greater scale and interconnection than most people had ever experienced in their everyday life. The next stage of this, global expansion, would have seemed only a distant possibility, entirely dependent on the former. In addition to this, it must be remembered that the CCP's strategy of state construction was popular not so much out of some supposed cultural attachment to a strong state, but precisely because of the party's promised reinvention of the functions of the newly extended state. Again, the Chinese peasantry had, traditionally, lived in a quasi-stateless life, marked by various forms of community and solidarity, but the quasi-statelessness of the village was in reality more an amalgamation of micro-states, and each form of community and solidarity, familial, religious, commercial, was in fact the designation of territories controlled by overlapping micro-monarchs, patriarch, priest, merchant. This balkanized confederacy of minor regimes was in some ways linked upward to the de jure bureaucracy of the governing dynasty. Local thugs associated with particular clans might gather taxes from villages, taking a cut for themselves before delivering the rest to higher-order governors. Similarly, priests or gentry trained in Confucian scholarship might act to quell dissent against a larger regime, but for the most part, everyday life saw little contact with the state as such, while regular contact with these microstates was not understood as contact with a state at all, but was instead rendered in terms of ceremony, tradition, Confucian self-governance, etc. After the anarchist attempts to utilize indigenous forms of solidarity and community failed, both communists and republicans turned to the strong state as an alternative. But whereas the nationalists, in practice, emphasized the state's disciplinary force against the populace, the communists emphasized both its redistributive power and its capacity for coordination. The state to be constructed was not just one that extended all the way down, but one that, when rooted to the local, would also connect that locality to the general social wealth. The creation of China was, therefore, an economic project. It was this promise, above and beyond any nationalist mythology, that amassed support for the CCP's program among the country's peasant majority.